Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Mazer, and I am the Director for ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I also am Chair of the Workplace Conflict Management Section of the Interagency ADR Working Group. And so those two bodies welcome you here this afternoon, in addition to DOE, who welcomes you here, to celebrate Conflict Resolution Day. My agency celebrates Conflict Resolution Month, and many people celebrate Conflict Resolution Week. But in any case, today's the day that you're celebrating it here in this venue. So let's start with just thanking people. Pam Pontillo, Victor Voloshin, and outside we have Janet Frymuth, thanks, and Rita Franklin, and Kathy Barkey, and Elizabeth Bissell, and Charmaine Oliphant, and who else is upstairs? Thank you. So all those people helped to get you in here and to make this possible. So a lot of people work, there's a lot of hands working behind the scenes, and we just want to thank everybody, because many offices within Department of Energy and FEMA and the Department of Justice and EEO helped to make this happen. So just a heads up on what we're going to do next month, which is November. That'll be November 17th. I'd like to tell you about a presentation that we're going to do. It's about the boss whisperer, which is a brand new concept about how to deal with bullying in the workplace, intimidation, forceful and aggressive personalities. So this is something we really want to focus on as ADR professionals. So Lynn Frazier is the expert on that, our local expert. She's been doing a lot of research, and she's agreed to speak to us on all of the most recent and current thinking about bullying in the workplace. So that's November 17th. We'd love to see you for that. And now turning our attention to what we're doing today. John Settle is talking to us about feedback. Let me tell you a little bit about John Settle's background. So he is a certified mediator and a mentor coach, and he's been working in this field doing these kinds of things for 25 years. He teaches at George Washington University and also Northern Virginia Mediation Services. He is the past president of Virginia Mediation Network. He regularly speaks at ACR, FDR, and the ABA Dispute Resolution Conference. When he was a federal worker many years ago at HHS, he received the Presidential Award of Meritorious Executive for Senior Executive Service. So he's highly rewarded here in the federal workplace, knows an awful lot about our side of the fence, even though now he is retired. And
Semi-retired.
Oh, indeed. Let me be clear. He is not kicked back. And finally, I want to just point out, he is one of the original founders of our local federal ADR network, which is the group that brought forth ADR into the federal government after the Administrative Dispute Resolution Act was passed and things started to really gain momentum, or maybe even before that, yeah, before the law?
Well, there was some, but I think the ADR Act is what really got it going.
Good. All right. Well, John is an absolute bastion of knowledge and expertise with regard to all the topics that we're involved with in ADR. So we're really lucky to have him speak with us today to celebrate Conflict Resolution Day. So thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much, Cindy, and welcome to everybody here. Now, let's wait till the end. If you like it, you can give me applause then. There's a lot of people on the line, I understand, because that's the way this is done nowadays, and there's some people here, and welcome to both of you. There's going to be the ability to present questions online, as I understand it. And, you know, I'm not going to save everything to the end because I kind of want to talk with you. It's a little bit distant here, but I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to exchange some ideas. Really what I want to do is talk about feedback, and I want to talk about it in not just an ADR context. I want to try to generalize from that to the management context, to the organizational development context. I think I have a very good friend who I will not name, who says to me, who's heavily involved in ADR, mediation is dead. I don't quite go that far. I think mediation is changing, it's morphing, it's beginning to grow. It's not enough to be merely a mediator anymore. And it's beginning to grow in the direction of enabling all sorts of players in the workplace, particularly managers and middle managers and supervisors, but also employees and the various other kinds of people who engage in ADR, such as ombuds and coaches and all of those kinds of people. I'm getting a little feedback here. You okay? All right, well, let me go ahead and let's just talk a little bit about the distinctions I'm going to try to work with First, a mediator's use of feedback techniques, and we talk about mediation. Any of those are, how many here are in ADR or mediation? Just raise your hand. Okay, most of you present, probably a lot of those online too. And a mediator is dealing more immediately with conflict, typically between a couple of people or a small group, and they're using feedback to show that they hear, to build their trust with the parties, to be able to engage. And so it's a much more interactive, personal thing for the purposes of enabling the mediation and enabling the parties to move forward. And then you have a coach's use of feedback techniques, which is enabling a person who's being coached to grow, whether growing because they need to grow because there's been some issues with performance or behavior, or because they are somebody who really wants to try to get ahead and they're trying to grow their career or grow within an organization. And so you have kind of a growth orientation, if you will. Here, what we're going to be talking about a little bit is trying to come from some of those techniques down into managers' and an employee's use of feedback techniques as part of their engagement, typically around things like performance and behavior, whether that it has some difficulties embedded in it, or whether we're talking about how to help a person be at their best. So we're kind of broadening the concept, and I want to sort of, if I can, display some of the things you already know about in a slightly different context. And here's some dimensions we'll be talking about. They're in your package, which I assume these folks can get online or have available. So I'm not going to read all these, because each of these headings we're going to go through a little bit. Some of the ones that you may not be as familiar with that I think are absolutely vital we're going to touch on is trust. Trust is one of the subjects that's not well displayed, I think, in this day and time to managers, whether in private organizations or in the government. We're going to touch a little bit on that. It's such a critical thing. Metaphor, something you'll find useful in life as an ADR person, as a manager. Questioning, narrative, and a little bit about the language of negotiation, which is something I teach on as well. But I'm going to try to give you just a little bit of extra stuff, particularly some skills that you can use as we go along here. So let's start with the basic. That's the feedback 101. You know, what did you hear? And the classics kind of thing we get out of feedback or look for is repeating back what you heard to show the other person is being listened to and that she's being heard. And of course, that's just a basic of mediation and of course of active listening by people in organizations. Paraphrasing, to say in slightly different words or by a rewording of what you heard, to show not only that you heard, but that you understand. So those are really fundamental skills. You know, in the performance review area, a person may, you know, so you feel that your performance review was unfair. Tell me more about that. That's the kind of thing we might get in feedback, not going too much beyond that just yet.
John?
Yes.
Excuse me, could you adjust your mic? I think if your lavalier, if you could put it on your tie, then we hopefully will resolve the
Oh, okay.
the problem of the feedback.
Sorry about that. I think it is where he put it. Whoops, must have fallen off. I'm sorry. Is that better?
I think so.
Okay.
They'll let me know if not. Thank you.
All right. If it, you know, if it doesn't work, let me know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so those are the basics that you hear and you know about a little bit already. Anybody that's had training in active listening gets that. So let's go a little bit beyond that, just so that we can get a sense of the importance of this. I mean, why do we do this? Why do we want to feed back to people? Is anyone there that can just give me an answer, someone close to a mic? It sounds like a dumb question, but dumb questions are sometimes the best. Why do we want to feed back to people?
To show them that we are listening and kind of convey some empathy towards
Good.
what their point is.
You're getting at it. It's not just to show we're listening, because that's one of the mistakes I've seen a lot of people make, managers in particular. They had a little training in active listening, and so they pick up some of the things. I was working with one in a setting last week, I won't name where, but this manager said 2 or 3 times to somebody on the other side of the table, it was a large group thing involving a union group and some management. And the management said, I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. Well, it became pretty clear after a long time that he didn't have a damn clue about what they were saying, and that what he had learned is a litany, is if I can say that I hear what you're saying or I understand what you're saying. And so I intervened there just very gently at one point with them saying, well, I'm just wondering, Bob, I'm curious, can you repeat back what you heard Jim say? I made the names up. And it rapidly became clear that he had not really thought about taking it a little further. So we're doing this in the best sense of being responsive, and that's the reason I entitled this Responsiveness. There's been some literature around this that says the general topic of responsiveness is really critical in terms of interacting with other people in organizations. And we break it down on all kinds of subjects, but the idea is getting back to being in there for the person and with the person in the moment in this interaction. And so the reason we're doing that is to build that and not merely to display that we're being empathetic, because phony empathy is the worst kind. People generally read that pretty well. So we want to do that. We want to show and tell, and that's part of it. Again, not just what I think I hear you're saying is, but you're showing by your engagement, your movement to the person, your body language, maybe your eye contact, all of those things. If you get it right, you know what happens? You've seen this 1,000 times, I'm sure. The person does this. They do two things. They say, yes, and the yes says, you got it right. It's sort of a spontaneous and emphasis kind of statement. Yes. And then the next word usually is something like and, because now they feel a little bit more free to go on. And you've built that touch more spontaneousness out of the wariness. So those are some really key things about feedback. Now, one of the things, when I first got trained as a mediator long years ago, and I was a manager in the federal government, I did this on my own time. And I got trained as a divorce and child custody mediator on my own time, and I would do that in the evenings and on weekends sometimes. And my mentor, when I was trained, the first one I trained with, and we were in a case, and so she said to the person, one of the people across the table, she said, so what I hear you saying is, nothing wrong with that. Except about the 15th time that she said that, I got a little annoyed with it myself, privately, and I think the parties began to do it too. So what we want to do is to escape these sort of rigid boundaries, and there are ways to do that, just so you know, and they're kind of skill-oriented things too. One of the little things to learn, and this comes not from me, but from down at Eckerd College, Craig Runde, he was a big teacher on communication and mediation. He loves the idea of the one or at most two-word feedback. And it's a wonderful little skill to learn. You're meeting with the other person and you're listening to them. And as you go along, you just look for the opportunity when the other person takes a breath or a pause and feedback some key thing you've heard. Angry. Troublesome. At most 2 words. Maybe he'll forgive you if you go 3. But the idea is to pick out some thematic sense that you can sum up with just 1 or 2 words, and that's all you have to do. It's as much feedback as you're going to get by saying, what I think I hear you saying is. So I would give you all the charge of trying that. It really works very well, and it's non-obtrusive. People buy right into it. Another thing is a statement as feedback, and of course, any of you that remember back, this is beginning to retreat into the past now. Johnny Cochran in the O.J. trial, who's dead now. He was a lawyer for O.J., and he would be cross-examining someone on the stand, for example, an expert, and he'd say, well, you're good at your job, aren't you? Yes, I am. You're proud of what you do? Yes, I am. And he would go on in that frame. Now, he was using it for a different reason than we in ADR and management are, but it's the same kind of technique that can do. You can do exactly that and not have to get back into litanies. So you feel that was unfair? I really do. Tell me more about that. So, I mean, you can use these direct statements as a way to get into that feedback loop, too. And then finally, I think one of the things that you can do is just dialogue. And one of the things I like to tell people to do, if you want to learn about the art of dialogue, here's your lesson for the evening. Go home and watch Charlie Rose on TV. It's the best education you'll ever have in the art of simply talking with people. You'll never hear him once say, so what I hear you saying is, he'll just engage in a conversation with the people. And sometimes it frees him to ask that dread word that we don't like to ask as mediators, why? We don't like to ask why because it can put people on the defensive sometimes, and it's a little challenging. But Charlie Rose builds this sort of trust in the engagement, in dialogue, and he can ask why. Well, I'm wondering, why did that happen? And the people buy right into it because there's a conversation going on against the background of trust. We're going to talk a little bit more about trust. So don't be afraid to talk to people. There's nothing wrong with that. You're not going to impeach your impartiality, or you're not going to somehow or other take away from what you're doing. Dialogue is perhaps the best kind of engagement and feedback. Just as a little example of that, one time I had a mediation I was doing with a woman who was fond of using this little phrase that came out of Jerry Seinfeld. Yada, yada, yada. You ever hear that? And she would say, well, you know, there it was yada, yada, yada again. She said that maybe 2 or 3 times. Well, later in the mediation, as we were going along, I was looking at her and something came up, and I said, well, it sounds like it was yada, yada, yada again. She says, you got it. It's so important sometimes, and that goes to metaphor too. We'll talk about that later. But be where the people are that you're working with. If it's an employee that you're trying to give feedback to about performance, if it's somebody in an ADR proceeding, or whatever it is, sometimes it's this issue of responding and being with the party. And that's what all of these things are about. Okay? So let's move on a little bit beyond that now to another kind of responsiveness or feeding back, and you all know this one too. And stand by the mic there, because I'm going to ask somebody to try 1 or 2 of these just to see if we can. Reframing. Now, reframing is basically responding to a speaker while adding a little something extra. So it's not just, you know, feeding back or restating what they've done or paraphrasing. It's now maybe adding a little element, implying a different but related perspective, usually positive, but while staying within the speaker's frame. Now, Bernie Meyer, who I think is one of the greatest authors in mediation, if you read some of his books, he says the art of reframing is to maintain the conflict in its richness, but to help people look at it in a more open-minded and hopeful way. And I'm going to throw out a couple of quick statements for you experts out there, at least here in the studio audience, to reframe for me. And if you can, just try this. You're not going to get it wrong. And that's the nice thing about mediation. We got a lot of room to make mistakes, okay? And there often aren't. Here you go. Ready? Reframe this. I won't work with a liar. I won't work with a liar. Somebody reframe that. Want to give it a shot? I'll give you 2 or 3 seconds here. No one even want to try? How about this? The truth's important to you. Oh, okay, you got. I'll give you another chance. I'll give you another one. How about that?
It's good to see that you value honesty.
Okay. All right. What's that?
No worries.
Okay, I won't worry. Okay. A manager says to you now, let's say you're a mediator on this one, he just can't do the job. Just can't do the job. Reframe that. Anybody want to give that one a shot? How might you state that a little bit differently to try to move things along in some positive direction? Yes.
You worried about getting the work done?
That's a good one. That's a very
Getting
good
the work
one.
done.
You're concerned about getting the work done. Worried might have a little twist to it that the person doesn't want it to be. You know, that's where we try to use positive phrases. I'm concerned, maybe not worried. But the principle's exactly the same. Well, I won't go on with those, but those little reframing things just give you an example of how what you can do sometimes is restate without changing what they've said, except giving it a little bit positive thing or opening it up like a flower so that we can begin not to just wallow in the negativity of what's been said, but begin to open it up to other possibilities. And that's what reframing is really about, and anybody can do that. All of this stuff's hard work, okay? And so what that means, that so many people don't do it. Because, why? You have to stop and think. You know, you can't just, and I see so many beginning people, and managers too, yeah, okay, and then they go on. They'll just sort of give some kind of positive little stroke, or then, you know, Yeah, I got you, or I heard that, and then they go on. It's hard work to stop and think and do a little bit of feedback and reframing, but it is such a critical thing, and it's such an easy skill to learn. It's like riding a bike. You do it a few times and you got it. And I recommend it to everyone, and particularly in these settings where we're trying to really engage a person. If you get it wrong, and sometimes you will, view it as less of a problem than as an opportunity, because now it's an opportunity to clarify. You might not apologize. Some people don't like apologies, but sometimes I just say very easily, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that right. Tell me a little bit more about what you really meant there. And so it's an opportunity to go on and engage. And all of that is that basic stuff, if you will, of feedback in the kind of sense that we so often learn it in active listening and in mediation skills. Moving on to another, the language of humanity. This involves two elements to reflect on. One is that, and I think managers in particular need to be invited to reflect on this. Some get it, some don't. We are emotional creatures. People are emotional beings, and the workplace is a highly emotional environment. And so oftentimes we will hear managers say, in effect, well, emotions don't belong here. This is the workplace. We don't get into those kinds of things. You leave the emotions home when you come to work. And that's absolutely impossible. The workplace is as emotional a place as even at home sometimes. In fact, there's one I'll come back to. Is your workplace like a family? Are families emotional? There's a different reason why I don't like that little trope, the workplace like a family. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but you'll hear that a lot. Showing empathy is about showing that you understand that others have emotional feelings. It's not about being nice. One of the problems I have had so oftentimes is engaging managers who are afraid to tell hard truths, or who are afraid to engage from the point of view of honesty, because they don't like not being nice. And that's not your job. Your job is to be respectful, to be open, to be transparent, to tell hard truths. If you tell them respectfully, and if you've done some of these other things and listened well and built trust, and we'll come to that in a minute, you don't have to worry about being nice. In fact, your niceness is oftentimes likely to ring untrue, and I will go so far as to say this, and you can throw tomatoes at me if you like. If you get too worried about being nice, you may be a coward. You can't be a manager and be a coward, because you have a responsibility to tell sometimes hard truths, okay? And employees ought to know to expect their managers to tell the truth and tell them well. So that's just part of all of that. Be yourself. Be real. People will read phony empathy, and that's been the downside of teaching people about active listening. They learn little pet phrases, but they don't really mean them. And that's the reason I prefer to call it being responsive rather than, feeding back. And then, of course, try to recognize hot buttons, yours and others. I don't need to go too far into that. We all know what that's about a little bit. Here's another perspective on that, which I love. Comes out of the Harvard Business Review, Spotlight on Influence. Now, the Harvard Business Review isn't exactly a touchy-feely thing. It is a sophisticated collection of articles for managers on productivity, in effect. And here was a result of research. I'm not going to read it to you all. You can read it as I'm jabbering on here. But the lesson from this is it turns out that all of this Harvard-oriented research shows that one of the most important things to do is show some warmth. That is, the idea of warmth, that responsiveness, that trying to be where the other person is to the extent you can, is one of the key elements to getting things done in organizations. And you can read that on your own later. Well, all of this brings me to trust, and I want to talk about this a little bit, because the language of trust is one of the most important things to giving good feedback, because it enables people to give constructive feedback. If you want an employee to accept your feedback, it helps if they trust you, okay? It's that simple, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. You've probably all read that by now, and so here we go. Trust is easy. Trust is assured reliance on the character, strength, or truth of someone. Confident hope. It implies that there's some vulnerability there, that I am extending my trust to you when I'm a little bit vulnerable to you. And an employee is vulnerable to their boss for their ratings, and a boss is vulnerable to their employee for performance. Remember, the only thing a manager needs, the only single thing that's absolutely indispensable is people to do the work. They're vulnerable to those people, so it works both ways. Now, distrust is very, very different, and this is what we're going to talk about avoiding. It's not just the absence of trust. There's 4 parts to this, and I want you to reflect on them as we go along. Negative expectations about someone, signaling fear or dislike of them, a propensity to attribute sinister intentions to them, and a desire to buffer yourself from their conduct, usually by running away or whatever. Anybody ever experienced that? Have any of you ever, I'm not going to ask you to try to get a hold of a microphone, but have you ever worked in an organization where there was some distrust? Reflect on how that felt. I see some heads nodding. It's an awfully common thing, and it's not that hard to avoid, but managers, unfortunately, aren't often taught well how to avoid it. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And it isn't just about sort of, if you will, touchy-feely soft skills. I did some training at the Pentagon a couple of years ago in this organization, and they called the kinds of things we're talking about soft skills, which I thought was a most unpleasant kind of way to label it, as opposed to everything else they did. But nevertheless, there is that thought of it. In fact, trust, it turns out, and there's been research on this, comes about because of a physiological reaction in your brain. Trust signals, and we're going to talk about what those are in just a second, increase a peptide in your brain called oxytocin. Not OxyContin. Make that clear. It's called oxytocin, and this is called the trust, or in some circles, the love hormone, and that trust signals increase this, which in turn reciprocally increase trusting behavior. So there are some practical things you can do, and I'm going to give those to you right now, but it also, the consequence of doing these kinds of behaviors, increase trusting behaviors on the part of who you're dealing with. Remember, if you're in a distrustful organization, you got a problem, okay? And it's going to call for a lot of intervention by mediators and eventually lawsuits and all kinds of things like that. And so much of it can be avoided by avoiding distrust. So what do? Well, you engage in some trust-building behaviors, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but I do want to run through them because it's really important to understand this dynamic. These fall into 3 categories. First, behaviors that enhance your communication, avoid misunderstanding, and rumors. A distrustful organization oftentimes has a lot of rumors in it. 2, behaviors that build faith and character and deter suspicions about motives. Remember, one of the definitions of distrust is people start suspecting your motives. They start, in fact, making up reasons why you're doing it, which may have absolutely nothing to do with reality, and usually are pretty negative reasons. And you can see that. And then behaviors that display and grow competence. So let's just run down what some of those are. And I think you'll resonate with this. And these are the kinds of things you need to kind of work with your managers on, and for employees to expect, and I put it that way quite deliberately, of how their managers function. Mediators get involved in this a little bit differently, and we're not going to go into that today, but mediators need to build trust too, but they do it differently than this. 1, again, enhancing communication, avoiding this. To hold people accountable, be clear on expectations. If you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. Okay? Pretty simple statement. Actually, I think that was Forrest Gump that says that. But the point is that expectations are absolutely critical. And here's the bad news, and I'm going to tell you this coming hot on the trail of the NTEU presentation that was just talking in some detail about what to do about performance appraisals. Annual performance plans are not good expectations. First of all, they come once a year, or maybe twice a year if you do a midterm. And second of all, in most cases, and I'm going to make you an exception from what I heard from this gentleman that was speaking before me, they're not very good. I don't know if any of you have come from other agencies where you've seen a performance plan that's been in place in an organization for 5 or 6 years, and there's 6 elements, and they're all now printed on the paper slightly crooked and fuzzy because they've been Xeroxed so many times. And at the end of the year, people go one or two ways. Either everybody gets an outstanding, or the pets get high ratings and the others get in trouble and file complaints. Now, that's an oversimplification, but that's not an uncommon dynamic. Good expectations simply require this: communication between a boss and an employee, so that that employee has about a 95% accurate sense of what's due next week Thursday and what the measure of success is. Now think about that simple little thing. And what does it require? Communication. Respectful and open and transparent communication. That's what expectations flow from. Now they may be within the framework of a performance plan, but good expectations are much more in that kind of a framework. And you can't hold people accountable if you don't have clear expectations. And that's a duh, right? Seek transparency. John Wayne used to say, never explain, never apologize. Sorry, he's dead. A good manager engages in transparency, explaining what and why. You know, it looks like we're not going to be able to give a wide range of performance expectations awards this year. And the reason is that our budget, having stepped down in this administration and with the emphasis on fighting ISIS and other things, is much more limited, and I simply don't have the money to pass around. Or whatever it is, it could be something much more complicated. But the boss who says, look, I'm going to tell you what you have to do, don't worry about why, that's my problem. That's just a big mistake. Transparency is critical to building trust. Share information, promote information sharing within your organization. One of the biggest mistakes bad managers can make is start withholding information, almost unconsciously, and managing information flow. It comes out of a power dynamic sometimes. And so sharing information and promoting information up and down. You know, here's everything I know about what's happening, and let me know what's being said out there on the street. Accessibility, MBWA, management by walking around. That's one part of it. That simply means stop relying in your office on nothing but email behind a closed door. Email in many ways is a great blessing to our society. It's also one of the worst things that's happened to the workplace, because it enables managers who don't want to communicate or don't do it well to simply stay in their office and send out emails. And they can, I have so many stories I don't have time to tell you about emails that have gone wrong, but I'll tell you this one, just to give you an example. Employee and manager have been having some issues. The manager sends the employee a request by mail, said, can you give me this document explaining thus and such? And the employee complies, and a couple of days later sends the manager the information the manager wanted. And the manager writes back this note: thanks, I own you. He meant to say, I owe you. He mistyped that one letter. 6 months later, in an EEO complaint, the employee brought this among other emails. In fact, he had a stack of them in to show, this shows the mentality of this man. He thinks that this is a plantation, that he owns us. And it was a dumb email mistake. And we make them all the time. It's just an example. So what accessibility means is it makes an effort to get out of your office, walk around, talk to people, engage them responsively and empathetically. You know, if you're walking around, how's your mom doing? I heard you say that she had broken her leg, a little conversation. And then, you know, along the way you can say, by the way, you need any help with that project due Friday. That's accessibility. Such a simple thing. And it builds trust, and trust in turn helps you avoid problems, complaints. EI, emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman stuff. You know, learning about what emotional intelligence is and how to exhibit it. A lot of little simple things in there. Again, listening, a sense of humor. is a key element of somebody who's emotionally intelligent. It doesn't mean I want you all to become Jerry Seinfelds. You won't. But it does mean to be warmth, that warmth thing. Those kinds of things. Listen, and all that good stuff we already talked about and you already know, right? Active listening and those things. That's a key part of enhancing communication. Respond timely to concerns. I'm dealing now with the facilitation of this union labor partnership council, and one of their complaints has been that so many times they present management with a question or a concern or a report or something, and management doesn't get back, and management has sort of been forced to say, well, I'm very busy and I can't always, and of course now that message comes down like we're unimportant. So we're just off to the, you try to respond timely. If it's something that you can't fill out fully right now, you can at least say, look, that's an important thing. I've got something else on my docket right now I got to get done. I'll get back to you tomorrow, I promise. And keep your promise. Those little things matter, and those little things build trust. Look to the future and solutions, try to escape the past. We get captured in the past. It's such an easy thing to do. And we do that sometimes because we want to self-justify and because we believe strongly in our view of what happened in the past. And the other side does too, and we're off to the races. And of course, litigation is very good at dealing with the past. In fact, litigation is all about parsing the past finely, testing evidence against standards. But good communication skills and, of course, ADR approaches are about trying to escape the past to the extent we can and to look to the future for possibilities. In fact, Deepak Chopra likes to say, well, the past is kind of an unknown. Even if we parsed it very finely and were able to determine what it was, there were still many variations. But the important thing is the future has 1,000 possibilities, and we can choose what to work on those 1,000 possibilities. So look to the future, and solutions, try to escape past is a way to build trust, which is really important. Okay, remember now there are 3 points. The second one, building faith in your character, deterring suspicion about motives. Here's another one of these things that I have to say, duh. I mean, so many basic good management practices are so simple we forget them. I have yet to figure that out. And I've been guilty of it too when I was a manager. But here's a simple one. Tell the truth. How many managers have you seen or known that will quibble about the truth, avoid the truth, tell half-truths, say nothing, or lie? You don't have to answer that, but I know everyone in this room probably knows someone who has done that. Even hard truths. Trusted people will give you permission to tell hard truths, things that must be said even though they're difficult. And part of your avenue to building trust is to be willing to display your honesty. People will forgive a manager errors who's trusted. Part of building trust is to tell the truth. Be honest, even hard truths. Particularly hard truths because managers have to hold people accountable. So part of that sometimes is telling hard truths. Highlight interests, especially the common interests. You all know that, interests versus positions. Be consistent. Base decisions objectively. I mean, the definition of an EEO complaint, basically, in its simplest terms, is treating people inconsistently based on impermissible factors. Now, we don't want to oversell consistency because it's an enemy of creativity and an ally of bureaucracy. But nevertheless, in terms of treating people as individuals, we need to be treating them consistently in order to avoid those disconnects where that leads pretty quickly to EEO complaints. Make promises and keep them. People's perceptions are their reality. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here, but I bet everyone in this room has heard that cliche, but it is so true. People's perceptions are their reality. Yet time and time will hear managers say, oh, well, that's just their perception. It's wrong. Well, again, duh. Their perceptions are the reality, and if you're going to defeat a perception that has some error in it, then we have to do it in using all the tools we've talked about here and not just trying to confront it. People will believe strongly what they believe and what we need to do, and this is where we ask questions and work with them to get behind their perceptions of what the story is. Seek the best outcomes for people and your organization, not merely winning. I'm a big storyteller, and I don't have time for too many stories, but I love this one. I'll tell you real quickly. Several years ago, I was working with a military service, I won't name which one, and they were going through a reinvention of their whole rating process. And I learned something which was very interesting, which is that pilots, whether I guess they're in the Navy or the Air Force, are selected in part on their competitiveness. There is a sense amongst the flying services that good pilots and good fighter pilots, or else would we have them in the military services, are competitive people. And so we look for sports heroes and other people that display that competitiveness. So you're a pilot in the military service. Well, you don't last real long at that. You know, that's kind of an up or out thing, and a lot of them leave and go to be airline pilots, or they just move on because physically they can't, continue to have that kind of competency. So it's not long before they move on. And so many of them will stay in service of some kind, move into a civilian service. And what they do is that they will bring this competitiveness with them, in part because they haven't received a lot of training like this, if you will. And so what happens the first time one of their employees gets up in their face? They're a competitor. And of course, their job now is to beat them, to compete with them, to fly the plane into them or whatever. When in point of fact, what you need to do is be thinking about what's best for the organization, and as part of that, what's best for that employee and you. Putting that together to try to form a solution that takes into account what people need and where it can't entirely take into account that employee's needs, to be honest. But that doesn't fit with that, and so sometimes you do have these ex-pilots who get complaints, and they're a little bit bewildered, I told them what the situation was, that's my job. Well, there's a good deal more to it than that, isn't there?
John,
Yes.
there's a question from the phone audience.
Okay.
Can you rebuild trust once it's lost?
That's an excellent question, and I am going to skip ahead because I'm always struggling with, do I save that question until I finish my last point, or do I answer it now? And what I've learned to do over time is I answer it now. And here's the answer to that. It's very difficult. If you can do a lot of things to build trust from the beginning, all these things here, if you do them right, you're building trust. Once trust is lost, it's difficult. It can be done. It takes a combination of, at some point, time stops, if you will, and we begin maybe with a new manager, a new structure to begin doing some of these things. But usually you have to do a lot more. And when I engage this and I'm called into an organization, I like to do what I call a conflict assessment. And I've done that for several agencies. Typically what that involves is interviewing all employees in a unit, not confidentially, but anonymously. Because I tell them, I'm going to report what I'm hearing to top management, but I'm not going to have your name associated with it directly or indirectly. And then I take those things and I encapsulate them, and I try to bring them back into some themes, maybe 3, 4, 5 themes. And a lot of them will typically have to do with these things we're talking about: transparency, dealing with issues just in time, some other management issues of communication. And then we come into that organization and we may have a meeting with those employees and do some small group work in which they participate in redefining how the work's going to be done. Or top management may fire a manager, and I've seen that happen. Or a different number of combinations that say, in effect, this was the organization yesterday, we're changing the organization now to be a different organization tomorrow. That's what you have to do to deal with really difficult distrust. It takes time. It's not easy. And the answer is build trust in the first place, rather than getting to the point where you have to build back from distrust because it's difficult. I hope that answers the question. So let me come back now. We've talked about 2 of these things, the behaviors, if you will, that build trust, and the language of trust. And where's my little thingy here? Let's move to the next one. Oh, let me come back. I didn't get that last one, did I? Yeah. Be responsive to others. That ties back in. This responsiveness notion as being a combination of timeliness and empathy and the wording that's key. And then the final part of it is display value and grow competence. Here's a little tip for managers that I tell them when they're into this and they're trying to come out. I'll say, take a chance. Be the first to trust. Give that employee an opportunity to show they can do the job. Give that group an opportunity to show that they understand what the needs of the organization are as you've now explained them. Part of a manager's job is to be the first to trust. Acknowledge what you don't know, ask for help. A lot of managers don't want to, they want to pretend that they know everything and they get in trouble that way. Dwight Eisenhower, when he was commander of all Allied forces on D-Day in 1945, did not know how to fly an airplane. He did not know how to drive a tank. He did not know how to do 100 other things that his men necessarily had to know, but he knew how to lead men. He knew how to plan an invasion, okay? So his competence wasn't the competence of everybody. And one of the things he was supposedly very good at was asking advice of other people. So acknowledge what you don't know and ask for help. Give people room to make mistakes and learn. I mean, you can't jump on every mistake like white on rice. You've got to give them a chance to learn from it. Give constructive feedback. Invite and respond to theirs. Show gratitude. Praise publicly, reprimand privately. Be respectful in word and deed. That's the only word up there that's underlined, and it's for the simple reason that showing respect, human respect. There's two kinds of respect in the workplace. There's one that you earn. You earn the respect of your boss for doing your job well. You are entitled to respect as a human being all the time. You get the difference? Now, even when we're giving feedback on performance, the human respect has to be there. And then continuously look for ways to help people grow and learn. All of those little things together are trust builders. And if you have built some trust, and mark my word, there's not one manager that won't violate one or more of them, because you're human beings, and they're human beings. But the more of this you do, the more likely you are to get away with it. Let's see, I got that. That is, the trusted manager will hit a hard spot sometime, and he does a dumb mistake. And time again, his employees are going to give him room to do that. The distrusted manager is the one that's going to promptly be facing an unfair labor practice, an EEO case, something in MSPB, a complaint to his boss, or just staying home and not doing the work. Is this making sense? Good, I'm glad to hear that. Reading about trust, just here's a couple of books. If you access this online. That first one I particularly like. It's a real easy read. Covey book, Speed of Trust, the one thing that changes everything. There's another one there too. This is one thing, and this last word I'll say, you probably think I'm overemphasizing it. Not enough is taught in the workplace to managers and employees about the nature of trust, how to build it, how to overcome distrust. It's just absolutely critical. We all hear active listening skills. We all hear a little bit about team building, but not enough about trust, and that's something you can take to the bank. It'll work for you. Metaphor, this is another one I don't want to spend too much time on. Am I okay here? I keep banging into this. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a phrase is applied to something else that it's not applicable to in order to suggest a resemblance. There are a lot of similar terms, and I'm not going to get into the dynamics of all this from a philological kind of point of view. Similes, analogies, hyperbole, euphemisms. The reason it's here is because it turns out, particularly in the English language and in American workplace settings, we are awash in metaphors. And as you'll see in a minute, they kind of help describe people because they're so personal to them. Here's some examples. Brave as a lion, mean as a snake. The war on poverty. Now here's something that you can learn about the dangers of metaphors. The war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson. It implied we're going to make a great effort at great cost to try to defeat poverty. What's the trouble with warring on poverty? Well, there's collateral damage. There is potential death in there somewhere. We're bombing things. So the metaphor may contain some things that are difficult. Here's another example of that we'll come to again, and it goes back to something that I dislike personally. The boss says to everybody, My workplace is like a family. I'm sure some of you have heard that, right? And the good intent of it is that a family is a place where we are intensely concerned about people personally, and we strive to support them, and we do as much as we can for them. It is a nurturing, wonderful place, right? Good metaphor. Dark side of the metaphor, families have mommies and daddies and everybody else's children. So the boss, by using that, might be implying that he's the daddy of the organization. Do you want to work for a daddy? You want to work for an effective leader. And are you a child? Hell no, you're not a child. So remember that metaphors can have different mixes, and sometimes you need to recognize that. Stuck between a rock and a hard place. I don't have a dog in that fight, meaning that's not something that involves me. My boss barks his orders. I felt stabbed in the back. Here's another one. I have an open door policy. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard that when it's far from the truth. And it's a euphemism that somebody has heard because it sounds like a good idea, and there's a great distance between the truth of it and the actuality of it, which, going back to my principle to underdo and trust, creates distrust because it's a disconnect. It's not true. So metaphors are important to know about and think about a little bit. And I invite you to think about some of your own that you see. I'm not going to spend too much time here with it. Here's why they're important. They offer a safe way to discuss difficult subjects or to express indirectly what you can't easily say directly, or to illustrate meaning vividly. I'll give you an example of the latter one. I had a dispute I was involved in at a university where two people, a man and a woman, were peers who were dependent on each other for getting a certain job done. And they had fallen into a difficult patch. So the first thing that happened is their boss, this is a byproduct, decided that he would send them to mediation. Boss says first should try to solve the problem themselves. If it doesn't work or there's some reason why they can't, fine, use mediation. So they came into mediation, and I was meeting at one point very early privately with the two of them. They were hard to get together in the same room. And I asked the woman, what is this about? And she said, treachery. Just like that, her whole voice changed, her face changed. And she said, treachery. So loudly, I was thinking Aaron Burr or whatever. But, that was her metaphor for a failed relationship in which she felt that he was undercutting her oftentimes with her boss and blaming her for errors that weren't hers. But she was invested in that term, treachery. And so, of course, what we do is we work within it. What does treachery look like? I'm curious. How do we escape from treachery? What do we do to overcome it? And then we're kind of at that juncture sometimes working within her own term. Another quick one, one time I had a woman in an EEO complaint who was a smoker. And at one break, I stepped outside, and there she was smoking. And she says, I came to this mediation with a box of papers, and I wish I could take those damn papers and burn them. And I didn't say much to her out there, but later on, just as we went along the way, as we were developing options and beginning to build them, I said a couple of times, we're getting closer to burning those papers. Maybe I'd catch her walking down the hallway, as we were coming back from a break. Get the matches ready, get the fireplace ready. And she'd laugh. But the whole thing was we were working through her metaphor. It's just a little technique that you can use so effectively because we just are awash in metaphors of all kind, and they are very meaningful to people. They tell you what that person is all about. They're a window on a person's unique experience and perspective. They give you an opportunity to work within their experience to connect with that person on their terms. And then they give the listener, be it a mediator, a boss, an opportunity to reframe and explore meaning, okay? I think bosses can benefit by taking some mediation skills training. They can't be mediators because they can't be independent, neutral, or impartial. But they can use the skills, and that's what we're talking about here. the listening skills, the reframing skills, the metaphor skills, the understanding the use of trust skills. All of those things are really, really valuable things. Okay. Questions. Oops, let me go back a second. Yeah, here we are. Questioning, the art of powerful questions. One of the most effective things you can do is so simple people overlook it, and that's actually just asking questions. I mean, there's an art to this too. I mean, one of the things you've all been taught in ADR and probably in active listening as part of your media management skills is you ask open-ended questions as opposed to close-ended questions. Open-ended questions are the ones that people have to express themselves in a complete sentence. They can't just give you a yes, no, Thursday, that kind of thing. And the purpose of asking open-ended questions is because you want them to talk. And why do you want them to talk? Because you want to listen to them. And as you're listening to them, you want to feed back to them what they're saying. And you want to try to help them see some different perspectives and begin to build for the future. So that's all about open-ended questions. Why questions are a little bit different. Generally, we teach, and again, this is part of the lore most of you have, is we try to avoid why questions because sometimes why can be challenging. It could say, you did wrong, so tell me why you did wrong. Not always, and once you've built some trust with the person, you can ask those why questions, but as a general rule, we want you to ask, where, what, when, all those kind of questions. Questions can take us well beyond active listening, on into dialogue and exploration and personal reflection and gain. They are change agents, okay? I'm going to give you a list of books to read more because we don't have time to get into it in great depth. Curiosity questions linked to a growth mindset are particularly powerful. And I have one friend who has taught me to just simply ask, I'm just curious, why do you think your boss did that? Now, of course, I seem to have violated my own rule by asking why, but this is way down in the mediation. I'm curious, where would you like to see yourself in 5 years? I'm curious, if you hadn't come here today, what would have been happening next in the workplace? A curiosity question, and mean it. I want to know. I'm interested. It's something that sounds very interesting to me. And again, it's showing that empathy, that responsiveness. It's also enabling the person to reflect on it. Good question. And they answer, and they talk up, and maybe we can build. Mary Lee Adams is one of the books. You got it, I won't read it there, it's right there. Don't like to read my PowerPoint slides. Here's some examples of powerful questions. What's important to you? Just that simple thing. The person has laid out everything in just a simple question like that. Try it sometime. What's important? Or what's the most important thing here for you? This is one I use an awful lot of times, both in terms of coaching managers, employees, in mediation. Where do you see yourself in X years? Where do you see yourself in X years? I asked that one time of a gentleman who had had a long-term dispute with an agency, which I won't name, and I got a totally unexpected answer. He said, well, you know what? When I grew up out west, and we used to go out when I was a kid and corral cayuses, these wild horses. And he says, what I thought I'd like to do is retire, and I would go out and round up wild horses and sell them. That's interesting. And so we kind of began to use that, both as a little bit of a story metaphor, but also just as something to explore. What's involved in that? And his eyes took on a light, and he was talking about it. And so that became the subject of conversation. How can we get there? Because he was loath to have a manager ask him, when are you going to retire? Which some of you who are in the EEO business may know is actually evidence of age discrimination in the right context. So they were definitely afraid to ask him that. So what's it going to take you to get to a point where you can do that? Well, I got to get out of here. And what's that look like? And we began to work on it, and it's centered around the answer to that question. Where do you see yourself? It's amazing how many times you'll ask that to a person, and for the first time they have an answer. Or maybe they have an answer that has nothing to do with where they are. Powerful question. Here's one that works once in a while. Is there something not being said here that we should explore? Anybody can ask that. And people will say, yes, no, I don't know, and yes, there is, whatever. What change might help you accomplish your goals? You know, what if it doesn't work? What will we do next? What challenges are we facing and how might we meet them? This is another silly one. What question haven't I asked? Is there something I should be asking you that I didn't? And you know, a boss can ask that of an employee. What are your choices? What's possible? If you could do something else, what would you do differently? What would happen if? What's your plan? What's your next steps? And then, those are all powerful questions. And in fact, there are books out there that you can buy, whole books on powerful questions. And one of the things that I think you absolutely need to do is start thinking in terms of using them as a good tool. Remember, one of the things we learn when we're dealing with human dynamics and feedback and that kind of thing is, as a general rule, talk 20% and listen 80%. That's a good tip. I have a friend that likes to say, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And so sometimes you want to ask more and listen more rather than be talking. And that's part of the same game plan. Okay. Reading about your questions. Here's a list of what I got, 1, 2, 3, 4 books that I recommend any of you interested in learning more about questions as a vehicle for yourself, as a vehicle for the managers you work with, as mediators. Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. That's a very popular one by Mary Lee Adams. The Gentle Art of Asking Instead of Telling. That's a good one for bosses. And so on. There's a bunch of good books there that can read and teach you about the simple thing of asking questions, you know. And be humble in your questions. You're not asking, you know, smarty-ass questions. You're trying to help people grow and learn. Okay, let's see where we are. Okay. All right. Okay. Narrative, the power of stories. Most of this stuff comes from this book, and this couple, Mr. Winslade and Monk, have written a number of different books on this so-called narrative theory. There's one on narrative therapy. This one's on narrative mediation. And the concept is simply this. Every one of us has a life story. You spent all of the years of your life developing this thing that we could call a story or a narrative. And when sometimes you come in conflict, or even just association with another person, they bring with them that decades of story. And so the issue becomes, where do these things interact? And how can we help that interact? Obviously, sometimes they can conflict. They can conflict in terms of values, in terms of simple things like expectations in the workplace. And sometimes the conflict comes about because the person has a different life story. And so that's the basic concept. Can you relate to that? Can you see how you have a story? I don't know that story, and you don't know mine. But if we come together next week, a lot of what we may do has long tails and strings into that story. So sometimes when we're dealing with it, we need to be thinking about that. The top one I love, every conflict involves a story. And until that story is told and understood, the conflict is not likely to be resolved. So even our conflicts that we deal with will have their own stories that intersect others. People that live their lives through their stories, okay? And if you engage it, it helps people have a sense about who they are. And so a lot of times what we need to do is look for people's stories, think about people's stories. I'll give you a quick example. Fair. The word fair. Have you ever heard somebody say, that's unfair? I have 3 grandchildren, 2 8-year-old twins and 1 6-year-old. The first words I think I ever heard them or I remember them saying are, no fair. And you all know that as one of the most basic human concepts is a search for this thing called fairness. And it differs for people in different circumstances. And I hear it in workplace cases all the time. It's not fair. And the case may have a long, involved history enabled by lawyers of why it's an EEO complaint or an MSP thing or something else that's gone wrong. But at heart, when you start breaking it down, will emerge this issue of fairness. And here's an example where Winslade and Monk would say, tell me a story about when something happened to you elsewhere that was unfair. What was it and how did you deal with it? Or tell me a story about when you were treated fairly and how that felt. And those kinds of things. But the idea is that sometimes you go to them and let them give you an explanation of a weighted term or a metaphor or why we're here. From your perspective, tell me why we're here. I like to ask that sometimes. That's when I got that woman who said to me, treachery. And she had a whole story about treachery. And for her, that's what framed it. And we had to kind of work through that for her. The difficulty was that he heard the treachery and he laughed. Because for him, his story had to do more with how she was reacting to him. But the issue was, think in terms of their narratives and not just a piece of information or, well, how about if we got you a job in the other organization next week? Would that work? You know, jumping too easily to solutions. We want to find solutions sometimes and results and resolution of conflict, but sometimes we have to work through what they really need to get there, and in order to do that, we need to understand what their stories are. I hope that makes sense. Okay. The language of negotiation, and I'm a little ahead here, so I'll have time to take some questions and all, but here's something about negotiation. Perhaps, of course, I keep overemphasizing everything I'm saying is so important, trust is important. Negotiation skills are important. It's one of the most important set of skills an employee in an organization has and should learn. And you can take courses in it, okay? You can take a day-long course if you can find the money someplace and negotiate for it and how to negotiate. And it's one of the most important skills for managers because sometimes when they're dealing with an employee over an issue of performance or what we're going to do about, that manager is in a negotiation with that employee, and that employee is in a negotiation with their boss. And probably most of you know that, the simplest definition of mediation is it's a facilitated or assisted negotiation. The parties are in that negotiation and we help them. Sometimes we help them best by getting the heck out of their way. But negotiation skills are so important. And I'm not teaching a course here on that. I don't have time, but I'm going to give you the two principles I always put at the top of the paper in my outlines when I teach negotiations. And I've taught this in law school, and I do it there. The two principles that you teach everybody in negotiation break down to cover everything else. What are they? To get what you need, help the other person get something they need. If you're a manager and you need productivity in your organization and this is a key person and they got something that's bothering them, figure out what you can help them get for themselves in order to get what you need. Make no mistake, you're the boss. You've got to make that organization work, get productivity going. But in order to get there, sometimes what you need to do is figure out what that person needs. And then make it easy for the other person to see things your way. So many times we make it hard for other people to see things our way. Lawyers are really good to that. They threaten to eat your dog or, you know, act condescending towards you. I've seen that so many times. And I'm a lawyer by background, but seeing how poor negotiators lawyers can sometimes be. It's again, duh. Make it easy for the other person to see things your way. And how do we do that? Well, we listen to them. And we try to reframe what they're saying. And we engage their stories. And we try to understand what their underlying interests and needs are. And we tell truths, even though the truths may be hard. That's all part of that. And I hope that makes sense, because that's about all I'm going to say to you in negotiation. But that's the thrust of all of it. Okay. Okay, bringing it all together.
John,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. There is a question about negotiation.
Sure.
Should you always posit the alternatives to the negotiated settlement?
Now, I didn't understand the first part of it. Should you always what? Posit or propose?
Should you always post alternatives to a negotiated settlement?
The answer is maybe. It depends on the settlement. The concept there is, let's go back a half step because people may not all understand. The idea is that in every kind of an arrangement where you're negotiating something, there is for each side the the question of what, the terminology is BATNA and WATNA, best alternative, worst alternative to negotiate agreement. That comes out of the Harvard Project and negotiation. You don't have to do all that. But the issue is, if you don't get your deal, what happens next? And good planning for any negotiation is to think about what happens if I don't get the deal I want. There are lots of other parts of good planning, like what are your possibilities? What may you get? What do you have to give up? What are some concessions you plan for? So all of that is by way of background for your determining, before you get to the negotiation table, what are you bringing to the table? What do you want? How do you get it? And most importantly, what happens if you don't get a deal? And the reason we want you to know that and use it is because fear may drive you into a bad deal. And if you know what the worst is that can happen, like I'm trying to sell this car and I want to buy a new one, and this guy may not buy it, and you know, well, there's somebody else out there, or I can do this or that or the other. If you think about those alternatives, the doomsday alternatives, you're less likely to be fearful of them because you know what they are. So that's part way of answering the question. The answer is essentially, first of all, know exactly what your options are, good, bad, and ugly. And then the question of whether you put them on the table and when is a different issue that's very contextual. And I'm sorry, that's the best I can do as an answer. Invite the person to come back if I didn't get it. Okay? Anybody want to add to that?
I had a different question.
Sure.
It was going back to trust.
Yeah.
But what can an employee do when they sense they're distrusted,
Mm-hmm.
even if they're trying, or maybe they don't know what caused the distrust?
Sure. That's a very good question. I have one simple answer, but I'm going to first turn it back to you. If you were in that situation, what would you do?
I'm in the situation, so I open communication as much as possible. But I don't know what else I can do.
Okay, so you got partially the right answer, which is you start with the best of communication. And one good rule is tell the truth, which is to say, in effect, boss, I'm a little concerned here. I get a very real sense that you don't trust me, and I'd like to talk about that, because if it's something I can fix, I need to, and I need me to fix it if we're going to get the job done. So that's that example of tell the truth as part of communication. Now, if you have a totally distrustful relationship, sometimes you have to be careful because it could come back to bite you, but that's part of the distrust element. But first start with these principles. Tell some truths, ask some questions, and wait for the response and be respectful. You know, I've seen people that say, my boss is a jerk and I need him to know that, and that ain't gonna get you far. Yes, ma'am, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, hold on.
First of all, on your metaphors, just to let you know, when you were talking about treachery on Aaron Burr, my college roommate was a Burr from the family. So.
That one rang for you, huh?
But you also talked about situations where a boss can see an employee as competition rather than a resource.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice for any situation where an employee may see that that's the relationship, especially knowing that the playing field is not level? When a boss sees the employee as competition, it can be rather dangerous for the employee.
Sure can be. So that's fraught with difficulty. And you know, that's a place where you might want to try to get somebody in your corner to get some advice. You know, if you have, sometimes the EAP office can give you a little advice in this more contextual. But again, I would come back to the notion of first trying to be respectful of your boss and go where they are. Part of this is going where the other person is to get where you want to go. And part of that is recognizing, first of all, if your boss feels a little insecure because you may have some knowledge about something, and this may be a mixture of telling the truth, is to go to the boss and say, boss, you know, we got this meeting next week, and there's this one thing, and I wrote this paper on, and so I know a little bit about it. And I know you don't have that much knowledge. What I'd like to do is to try to bring you up to speed so you can go in there and do that if you think that might work. But I do want to make sure you're the boss here, and I want to support you in trying to figure that out. So you kind of go indirectly to an overt attempt to show respect for your boss and empower them in some ways. Another way might be to tell the truth. I'm not sure I would in this situation, but to say, You know, I'm a big truth teller myself, but I'd say, boss, sometimes I get a sense like we're in a little competition. And I got to be honest with you, that doesn't work for me because you're my boss and you got the power, and I feel a little endangered by that. You want to talk about it? Or is there anything, so that would be the truth telling. The other thing would be the enabling, to see if I can enable the boss to go further with it. If it's really, really bad, get the hell out of there. I mean, really, there are some situations, I'm a practical person. If you can't fix it, you're not going to fix everything with this stuff.
John, there is another question or request to comment on the following statement.
Sure.
With regards to the use of metaphors, would direct communication be more effective? Many people have different levels of perception and
Yes.
understanding, and simple direct communication seems to be more effective.
Yes, that's one of those logical kinds of things. Simple, direct communication, precisely stated, would seem to be more effective. The difficulty is, and this is the reason metaphor exists, sometimes expressing something indirectly pierces through the veil of defensiveness or a lack of understanding, or may express it vividly. Here's an example that I've used and I invite you to use occasionally. Well, I'll use an example you wouldn't because you don't do divorce mediation. But let's say you're in a divorce mediation and there's a couple and something's not being said. In the back of your mind, you're thinking maybe there's an affair and they don't want to talk about it. Could be anything, though. Could be a workplace thing, too. One way to approach that is to say, I have a sense there's something not being said here. What might it be? Perfectly fine. For some people, particularly some people who are of a more poetic state of mind, if I can put it this way, there's a poem by Robert Frost, which is a metaphor. It's 2 lines long. And the poem says, we dance in a circle and suppose, and the truth sits in the middle and it knows. Now that's such a powerful metaphor with the right people, because it says exactly what I said directly, which seems to be something that's not being said. But this way, it says it elliptically and poetically, and in a way it enables people to pierce through. So the answer is simply this. Metaphor enables people to say things safely, to see things differently, to say some things more vividly. My boss barks his orders. And instead of saying my boss sometimes speaks too loudly to me. It's that vividness. So the answer is, for that person, in their style of expression, they may well not resort to metaphor as much as others. All I'm asking you to do, in terms of your responsiveness to others, recognize it as just another tool to use that works very well for some people and not for others. I hope that answers. Any other? I got one more slide, two more I want to get through, but we got plenty of time. Okay, let me run on, and then we'll have time. Just bringing it all together, 2 things that break down in communicating about performance. Establish a positive background and baseline, including an environment of as much trust as you can. Trust doesn't mean I have to like you. Trust doesn't mean I don't think that I'm in trouble here. But trust means that I understand and believe that you are not out there to put a hole in my head, and that you will speak honestly and truthfully with me, okay? Create expectations in all directions about required and successful performance. That's on both sides. The boss has that obligation in order to achieve, productivity, and the employee has that obligation for self-preservation. If you feel that your performance expectations aren't clear, you have an obligation to self to clarify them. Then 2, provide feedback related to accountability, including positive and reinforcing feedback, building for the future. Use bridging questions, dialogue, constructive feedback in areas where things can be achieved or are expected. It's a collection of techniques that come from all of that lore. And the last one simply puts it in context for me. And I will tell you, I'm going to be straight up. It's because I've been an employee, but I've also been a manager and a senior executive. The manager-supervisor has an obligation to be open and honest about accountability and performance, good and otherwise, and the employee has a right to receive open, objective, and honest feedback on accountability and performance. Framing their discussion with trust-building behaviors, good communication practices, reduces tensions, promotes positive change and growth for both. that's the summary of what I'm about here when I'm talking to you, is we have all these tools and techniques. All of you know pieces of them because we teach about active listening. Some of you may not heard that much about trust before, but when you put this together as a package and build it into the framework of holding people accountable, providing feedback, this is the kind of stuff that I'm telling you, you already basically know in your heart and in your jobs. And we have to share that sometimes with the managers. We've got about, by my watch, about 5 minutes, and I'm willing to take some more questions, comments, any of you have.
Yeah, there is another question
Sure.
from the web audience. When trust breaks down and one party tries again by extending the tools outlined, for example, tell the truth, but it comes back to bite you. You're vulnerable and your truth is exploited, you're taken advantage of. What are strategies to deal with it?
Well, that's a good question. Let's come back to the first little thing that my grandfather taught me. Trust everybody, but keep your hand on your wallet. We want you to be trusting and opening, but if you feel you're in a situation where you're so vulnerable that a particular piece of information might be treated as, for example, a legal admission that would hold you responsible, don't be stupid. I'm trying to talk good communication practices, not being going so far over the line. In that situation, you know, you always are assessing where you are with the other person, and we want you to be open and trusting, managing the communication flow and all of that. But if there's really a distrusting relationship, probably the first thing you do is don't just jump in and make an admission, but rather consult somebody in your HR, ER, EEO, ADR office that can give some advice on some behaviors. They might want to bring in somebody else to do an assessment in the overall organization or maybe convene a mediation. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. I'm not trying to be touchy-feely and tell you to be nice to everybody in the world. You do have to be careful. Human beings are incredibly complex and sometimes duplicitous. But as a general proposition, you'll find that one of the things you should consider is telling a hard truth respectfully and doing some of these other things. Do I say that when you know it might backfire, you don't think twice? I'm not saying that. I hope that helps. Tell me if that helps.
Yeah, if you were listening to the previous speaker before yourself,
I did listen to him a little bit, not all of it.
you may have concluded that we've had a number of employee viewpoint surveys done, and we've had very, very consistent feedback regarding management and supervision, regarding their characteristics, so on and so forth. If these survey results have generated the same conclusions and the same data year after year, and yet in some areas we've seen lack of responsiveness to that and improvement in the organization, what can you conclude from that, and how does that affect the organization in general in terms of your study and your observations?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think you've kind of predicted by the nature of your question what my answer may be. But let's go back a half step. These government-wide surveys that are agency-wide are going all across government, and so many of them fall into this exact same thing. They point up a lot of dissatisfaction, and nothing happens, and then the survey is done the next year and the next year, and virtually nothing is done to respond to it. In my opinion, that creates cynicism and distrust, and the worst thing to do is to continue that practice. There has to be a concerted management effort, even if it's incremental, to try to pick part or all of that and do something different. And not just to make noises like we're going to look at this or whatever, because that just, it builds more distrust and people start taking those things not seriously, and it's a distrust builder. What would I do if I were the head of I don't know what you do with a giant department, but a small agency where that happens? I'd convene a group of senior managers and say, let's talk about this. Let's come up with a strategy and try to pick 2 or 3 things to work on. Not globally, not let's change everybody's minds, but what are 2 or 3 things that particularly stick in the employee's craw, and let's try to work on them. And maybe form a team that's joint with the union through the partnership, or if you don't have a union partnership arrangement with some employees, Maybe get a consultant who's an expert on, this kind of intervention, and try to come up with some solutions. Start small, don't try to do everything, and don't try to snow your employees. Most of all, don't ignore those surveys, because it does increase distrust, I think, government-wide.
One more question?
Thank you so much for coming. I hope you all got 1 or 2 things out of it, maybe 3. But remember to try to build trust, be open, be respectful, be humble.
John, you have given us such an array and beautiful palette of great ideas, suggestions, research, and techniques. I really want to thank you, and I feel like we're all kind of powered up now around this issue of trust. So you're sending us out into the world with that on our mind. So thank you very much.